Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. La verdad es que yo estoy muy contenta de estar aquí por muchas cosas. Primero porque los que sois de Gerona tengo que deciros que tenéis una ciudad fantástica. Tuve la oportunidad de estar, creo que fue la semana pasada o la anterior, dando una clase en la universidad y lo disfruté muchísimo, con lo cual al señor alcalde por la parte que le toca y a todos los que vivís aquí, felicidades, porque bueno, es una maravilla de ciudad. En segundo lugar, estoy muy contenta de estar aquí porque la verdad es que me estoy intentando resistir, pero creo que vengo de cuota. Si habéis mirado el programa, solo hay dos personas de mi mismo sexo, que es Carmen y yo. Y las dos hacemos el rol de presentadoras. Pero tengo que deciros que, bueno, a mí me han dicho que tengo que hablar 10 minutos, que puedo hablar un ratito más, con lo cual quedará más. No es ninguna crítica a la EDES, sino simplemente es un empujón a todas aquellas mujeres que también estáis en el mundo de la empresa, también estáis en el mundo de los negocios, y lo que sí que me ha hecho muy feliz es ver que en las primeras filas somos menos, pero que en las últimas filas donde estaba todo el enorme grupo de estudiantes, que ahora algunos han salido, hay una inmensa mayoría de chicas que aprietan fuerte y que yo casi pediría un aplauso para ellas. Bueno, me han pedido que al margen de presentar a Andrew, que yo estoy encantada de que esté aquí con nosotros. Thank you, Andrew, for coming and being with us. Os haga una breve introducción acerca de por qué creemos que esta ponencia tiene cabida en una jornada como esta, que es tan importante hablar del consumidor. Por cierto, Andrew habla un poquito de español, pero él va a hacer su ponencia en inglés. Sabéis que fuera tenéis translators. Si queréis aprovechar para utilizar alguno, pues fuera los podéis solicitar. Entonces, a mí me han pedido que haga un poco una introducción de por qué creo que esto es tan importante, con lo cual voy a pedir que pasen estas 10 charts que veremos muy rápidamente. ¿Por qué tenemos que hablar de nuevo consumidor? Pues porque es fundamental, porque la única manera que tienen nuestras empresas de ser competitivas, de ser innovadoras, es conocer cómo somos nosotros, cómo somos los nuevos consumidores, cómo somos los nuevos ciudadanos, para ser capaces, os diría, de predecir y avanzarnos un poquito a las tendencias y estar en una mejor situación, y para sobre todo ser capaces de adaptarnos. La buena noticia es que el ser humano es fantástico adaptándose. Vamos a ver un vídeo donde vais a poder ver un ejemplo, es posible que algunos ya lo hayáis visto, donde vais a ver un ejemplo estupendo, que a mí me encanta, acerca de la capacidad que tiene el ser humano de adaptarse. Este es un mercado tailandés. A estos señores que tenían su mercado de toda la vida les dijeron: tenéis que quitar el mercado porque por aquí vamos a pasar el tren, y ellos dijeron: no, ¿para qué vamos a quitar el mercado? Ya nos adaptaremos a las nuevas circunstancias. Digo yo que el tren debe pasar pocas veces, igual pasa una vez al día, porque si no hubiera sido demasiado complicado. Pero es un ejemplo muy divertido de cómo somos capaces de ingeniárnoslas y de adaptarnos, ¿no? Nunca el consumidor ha cambiado tanto como está cambiando en los últimos años. Nunca hemos visto tantos cambios en los 5 o 10 últimos años como los vemos ahora. De hecho, muchos de estos cambios bueno, tiene que ver con lo que nos encontramos cada día cuando vamos al supermercado. El consumidor nunca ha tenido tantas posibilidades de escoger, nunca lo ha tenido, por un lado, tan fácil para escoger, por todo el tema de Internet, para documentarse y demás, y nunca lo ha tenido tan difícil. Esta es una foto de lo que nos encontramos cotidianamente, o de lo que nos podemos encontrar cotidianamente cuando nosotros vamos a comprar. Una inmensidad de productos entre los que tenemos que escoger, a pesar de que el año pasado se publicaron los datos de un estudio que habían hecho Meaningful Brands, y los consumidores nos decían que el 73% de los productos, de las marcas que ahora mismo estaban en los mercados, podrían desaparecer y no pasaría absolutamente nada. O sea, un 73% de las marcas que conocemos, si desaparecieran de nuestras vidas, no nos pasaría nada. Y solo un 20% de las marcas se reconocían como marcas que aportaban valor y que eran capaces de mejorar nuestra calidad de vida. Os he puesto esta foto porque, no sé si es casualidad, pero como veis es la foto de un establecimiento comercial. Es la foto más cara del mundo, por la que más dinero se ha pagado en la subasta de Sotheby's. Se ha pagado 2.300.000 euros, creo que son, por esta foto. Es de un Andrews Woolke. Yo no sé a vosotros qué os parece, a mí me resulta sumamente estresante, y os diría que incluso, bueno, las fotos que yo he escogido para esta presentación diría que hay fotos más bonitas, pero bueno, es la foto más cara que se ha pagado hasta ahora y habla de consumo y de marcas. Como os decía, nunca el consumidor ha cambiado tanto en estos últimos años, nunca el consumidor ha sido tan dúctil, tan gaseoso, tan segmentado, tan formado. Nunca hemos tenido tanta formación como ahora. Nosotros que somos una empresa de estudios de mercado donde contactamos con consumidores, hacemos reuniones de grupo. A veces cuando los clientes se ponen detrás del espejo nos dicen, pero estas amas de casa, pero es que si saben de marketing, saben un montón. Nunca hemos sabido tanto de las marcas como ahora, ni hemos tenido tanta información, nunca hemos tenido tanta conciencia del precio de los productos. Hemos comparado precios por Internet, la crisis también lo ha favorecido. Nunca hemos tenido tanto poder para comunicar con todo el fenómeno de las redes sociales. Nuestro rol como consumidor es muchísimo más activo de lo que era antes y nunca ha habido tanta conciencia social. Muchos de estos cambios están provocados por todo lo que tiene que ver con los cambios en las estructuras del trabajo, por la forma, por cómo son nuestros trabajos, son los que van a condicionar parte de nuestro rol como ciudadanos y parte de nuestro rol como consumidores. Los valores sobre los que nosotros crecimos, con los que nos educaron en los años 60, 70, muchos de vosotros, los que más o menos seáis de mi generación, y la forma en la que nosotros entendíamos el trabajo en aquellos días no tiene absolutamente nada que ver a cómo es ahora. A nosotros nos hablaban de un trabajo para toda la vida, si era posible, o que nos iba a durar muchos años, de un trabajo en una oficina, en un espacio cerrado, en un horario establecido. Tú tenías una hora de entrada y una hora de salida. Tendíamos a separar claramente la vida laboral de la vida profesional. Decíamos cosas como, no, es que esto es de mi ámbito privado, esto es de mi ámbito profesional. Ahora no sé a vosotros, pero a mí me resulta sumamente complicada separar mi vida laboral de mi vida personal. El año pasado creo que publicaron un estudio en Estados Unidos acerca del empleo y decían que un joven cambiaría de media 15 veces de trabajo antes de cumplir los 38 años. Entonces, eso desde luego va a cambiar nuestra forma de ver el mundo, no solo de consumir, sino de ver el mundo y de entender la sociedad. ¿Y por qué entender estos cambios? Pues porque estos cambios, la comprensión de este entorno va a ser lo que nos va a dar la clave a nuestras empresas para adaptarnos, como decíamos antes, y para prepararnos para el futuro. Y estamos hablando de cambios de muchos tipos. Estamos hablando de cambios demográficos, de cambios sociales, de cambios económicos, de cambios tecnológicos, que últimamente son sumamente importantes, y todos estos cambios son los que nos van a marcar lo que nosotros llamamos valores imperantes o macrotendencias, que son dijéramos que el caldo de cultivo que va a hacer que determinadas categorías de productos crezcan, otras decrezcan, que haya determinadas oportunidades, que encontremos áreas donde podemos rápidamente encontrar nichos de mercado, etc. Entonces, todo esto es muy importante. Os voy a pasar muy rápidamente algunos datos que a mí la verdad es que me asombran para que seamos un poco conscientes de algunos de los cambios demográficos, por ejemplo, con los que estamos conviviendo, y que son increíbles a la velocidad que van. En 1950 había 200 millones de personas de más de 60 años. Se estima que en el 2050 haya más de 2.000 millones. En España, el 40% de los jóvenes tienen formación universitaria, pero hay un 41% de paro. Ayer por la noche yo oía las noticias y bueno, parece ser que esto ya se ha elevado. Hablaban de que el 52,7% creo que era, de jóvenes menores de 25 años en España no tienen trabajo. Un 1% de la población mundial se reparte el 50% de la riqueza. El 20% de la población mundial consume el 80% de los recursos. Y no sé si casualmente debe ser ese mismo 20%, probablemente haya mucha coincidencia, el que está conectado con Internet. Ha habido personas que me han dicho, hombre, tan poco, un 20%, estamos hablando de un 20% mundial, incluyendo no solo países o desarrollados, sino el África más profunda. A mí me sigue pareciendo increíble. Se estima que en el año 2015, en España, el 33% de las compras ya sean online. Y que el 53% de los compradores utilicen el móvil, ya sea para ejecutar esa compra o para al menos buscar información sobre estos productos. Está claro que todos estos cambios van a cambiar la manera de hacer negocios, y si no estamos preparados para ellos, yo creo que lo tenemos bastante complicados. En España ya hay el doble de usuarios de teléfonos inteligentes que de fumadores de tabaco, lo cual creo que es una fantástica noticia por otra parte. El Big Data, no vamos a entrar, pero el Big Data os aseguro que va a revolucionar la forma de hacer negocios. Lo que está claro es que el consumidor ya no hace lo que la marca quiere y nunca ha tenido tanto poder como el que tiene ahora. Eso sin hablar de los millennials, que es algo de lo que se habla ahora recientemente y que daría para, es posible que Andrew nos haga alguna mención, pero daría para una sola ponencia. Los millennials es el grupo de 18 a 29 años que desde luego tiene unos valores muy diferentes a los que tenemos nosotros, los más adultos, y que van a representar en 2025 el 70% de la mano de obra mundial, con lo cual hay que conocerlos y hay que saber qué les mueve, qué les motiva, cuáles son sus valores. Pero bueno, no hay que asustarse, simplemente hay que tener en cuenta que nunca, como hasta ahora, hemos necesitado ser tan creativos, tan flexibles, tan innovadores, y que, dejarme que haga un guiño, no sé si comercial, pero que no hay creatividad sin investigación, y a esto nos dedicamos de una u otra manera empresas como la empresa en la que trabaja Andrew o Millward Brown, en la que trabajo yo, en ayudar a facilitaros el conocer qué nos dice el consumidor, qué hay ahí fuera. Pero de todas formas yo os diría que no os preocupe, que es posible que muchos de vosotros digáis, bueno, pero es que nosotros trabajamos en el sector industrial, nuestros consumidores no son las amas de casa, los compradores es un mercado de business to business. Da lo mismo, no hace falta que hagáis estudios de mercado tradicionales para entender lo que hay ahí fuera. No sé si recordáis esta película, que era Expediente X, que a mí me encantaba cuando la daban, que decían una frase algo así como la verdad está ahí fuera. Entonces yo os diría que para entender estos cambios sociales es lo mismo, la verdad está ahí fuera. Simplemente hay que tener ojos, una actitud abierta y una cierta práctica para entenderlos. Hay que preparar la mente para estar dispuestos a ver lo que hay ahí fuera. No me voy a enrollar más porque la ponencia importante y a la que yo tengo muchísimas ganas de escuchar es la de Andrew. Andrew Carey es director en Londres de la compañía The Future Companies, que como veis incluso el nombre ya es en sí muy sugerente. Es una compañía multinacional del grupo WP con presencia en Europa, en Estados Unidos, en Latinoamérica y en Asia. Entonces es una empresa especialista, una consultora especialista en prever y predecir qué va a pasar. Cambios sociales, cambios culturales, tendencias, todo ello con la finalidad de ayudar a las empresas a identificar nuevas oportunidades, nuevos insights, que decimos los que trabajamos en marketing, para ayudarles a incrementar su negocio. Andrew ha trabajado como periodista en medios digitales, es un gran conocedor de los medios y de la tecnología de toda la era digital. Él ha dirigido un enorme número de proyectos sobre el futuro, tanto para empresas privadas como para el sector público. Ha trabajado, por ejemplo, para el Gobierno de Reino Unido en la previsión de sistemas de infraestructura y transporte inteligente y sostenible. Es escritor de numerosos papers y de numerosos artículos. Seguro que encontraréis muchos publicados por la red. Y todos ellos llevan títulos como muy interesantes, ¿no? El mundo del 2020, el futuro de la zona euro, escenarios tras la crisis. Entonces, él nos va a hablar de los negocios en el siglo XXI y de las diferencias que básicamente nos vamos a encontrar o nos estamos encontrando ya frente al siglo pasado. Él va a hacer su ponencia en inglés, pero tras la misma tendremos oportunidad de hacerles las preguntas que queráis. Yo me he cogido incluso un translator de estos, no sé si usarlo por no perderme ni una palabra, pero luego os invitamos a que participéis. Andrew.
I need that.
I'm sorry very much.
It's okay. Thank you, Pilar, for that kind introduction, and thank you for being kind enough to allow me to speak in English today. I'm also delighted to be in Girona because actually I'm a fan of professional cycling, and you can't be a fan of professional cycling without knowing that Girona is the training destination of choice for many of Europe's top professional cyclists. And my only regret is that I'm not here for long enough to get out on a bike and try some of those training rides. I should also just say before I start to speak that there will be copies of the slides available as a PDF afterwards. A quick word of explanation about the Futures Company. I'm not going to tell you about what we do. You can read all of that sort of thing on the internet. But I'm just going to say how we do it. We basically bring three perspectives when we look at business problems with clients. We're forward-looking and we're outward-looking. So we're looking beyond this, out into the future, and we're also looking beyond the sector. But we're also inward-looking. We look at people. And so we use a mixture of futures tools and ethnographic and other research tools to do all of that. We're also global. I'll talk a bit about that later on. So what I'm going to do over the next 35 minutes or so is these four stories. The first is about the nature of the 21st century business. The second is about changing attitudes. That's about consumer attitudes, but as we'll get to, I'm not sure that people think of themselves as consumers anymore. I'm not sure they ever did. The third element is difference to differentiation. So it's about businesses which have taken those insights about how consumers are changing and turned them into business strategies. And the last is actually a thing we call the kinship economy, about relationships. Some ideas about how you as a business can actually create those relationships that you need to be profitable and to grow. So, back in the early 1990s, when the UK was going through its last big recession, the artist Gillian Wearing went out onto the streets of London. And what she did was she gave people these big white cards and a pen, a marker pen, and she asked them to write down what were they thinking, and then she photographed them. I like this one. My grip on life is rather loose. Sometimes true, I think, for all of us at different times. Some of the others, there was a man who put up a placard which said, "I'm desperate." And he looked desperate too. He looked like all of his life was sort of draining out of his face. There was another man who put up a placard which said, "When is this recession going to end?" So although she did this slightly unusual sort of research in the early 1990s, there's something that feels very contemporary about it. It seems it's a set of work which has survived the last 20 years. And this is one of the most famous pictures that came from that piece of work. And what it says is everything is connected in life, and the point is to know it and to understand it. And I think if there's one thing that's changed in the minds of people, in the minds of consumers, in the minds of citizens, since the great global financial crisis, it's actually this idea that everything is connected. And in some ways, people, they may have a slightly loose grip on life to time, but they do understand that things are connected. And it's just worth saying kind of how they're connected, really. What we're seeing here is consumers and people being shifted. Obviously, we've talked about technology already today. You know, digital technology is everywhere. It's reshaping markets. Obviously, economics. I think we've had a lot of conversation about economics this morning. But the other thing that changes here in this world is values. And we're actually on the beginning of quite a big shift in values. And the one way of summarizing that is about talking about well-being. Well-being being the sense that your emotional sense, your psychological sense, your personal sense, but also your social sense. But actually, you need to have a sense that that is all in one piece. And there's quite a lot of interesting social values research which says that we're actually quite on the cusp of quite a big change, where in Europe and in the United States, around half of people are sort of moving towards a world in which those values about well-being are the most important to them, post-materialist values as opposed to modern values. And one of the reasons that's important for this discussion is that, you know, when we do futures work with clients, they understand technology, they understand economics, and they'll talk about that a lot. But actually, getting a grip on the values that are changing is much harder. And the reason for that is that, you know, values are inside us. You know, it's about like trying to talk to goldfish about what the water is like. So actually, this world of the 21st century consumer that I'm going to talk about is around this shift in values. And it's probably just worth noting, I'm not going to read all these out, but there's a whole raft of external changes, you know, around population, food and energy and so forth, that are also hemming in that world of the consumer, the citizen, and reducing the choices that we're able to make. And just to touch on some of those, you know, climate change, which has been discussed as something that's going to happen in the future for quite a long time, suddenly its effects feel quite real. You know, this is a recent picture of the Californian drought, and that big blob on the left is the way it's going to extend in the coming period. So effectively, the entire west coast of America is drowning in drought, or not drowning in drought. It's got to run out of water. On this side, we see this is global data from our Global Monitor survey. People worrying a lot about pollution. You know, Chinese parents take their children away from China because they don't want them to be brought up with the air pollution. In Europe, the World Health Organization estimates that more people die as a result of the air pollution effects of transport than actually die in road crashes. And obviously, the other thing that's happening here, I'm going to come back to this, is around business, especially big businesses, very much at the sharp end of this encounter. So, obviously at the bottom here, the Spanish protest about the banking system. Up here, this placard says, "No one should die for fashion." That's a protest against Walmart and the Gap after the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, where hundreds of women who were making clothes got killed, asking Walmart and Gap to do the right thing and actually put the funds in to help the families. And up on the left here, there, an English satire on the horse meat scandal that we had in Europe recently, where actually as you got into the story, it got worse. Originally, it looked like these companies didn't have control of their supply chain. Actually, when he went back and talked to the factory that had supplied the meat, he said, "Look, I was selling horse meat. Here are the bills. Here's what I sold them." So suddenly it became clear they had complete control over their supply chains, but they didn't really care what they were putting into it. So it's the kind of world we're in, and one of the consequences of that is that lots of people, since the global financial crisis, have started saying, well, actually, the model of business, the model of capitalism that we've had for the 20th century isn't any longer fit for purpose. This picture is from a book by Jeff Mulgan, who runs an institute in London. And his book is called The Locust and the Bee. It's a kind of pretty obvious metaphor. The bee is the productive insect, and the locust is the one that takes everything away. So he says your choice is, are you going to be productive, or are you going to just extract value? And what he says is that in the history of business, people have done both. They've been productive and extractive, but it depends where the pendulum is. Is it more productive? Is it more extractive? The second one here, this is the New Capitalist Manifesto by a man called Umair Haque, and he talks about companies needing to generate thick value rather than thin value. And he never actually defines thick value. You kind of have to read the book and get a sense of it. But what he means by thick value is value that lasts beyond the transaction. It's not just I'm just going to do this quick deal and then I'm going to move on. You actually want to have a relationship with the people you're doing business with. And the third one here I'm picking up is Michael Porter, the great kind of strategy theorist, the great strategy academic, and he talks about creating economic value in a way that also creates value for society by addressing its needs and its challenges. And I'm going to read a couple of bits from this article. It's 2011. It was in the Harvard Business Review. Because actually this is, one of the things you look for when you do futures work is signs of change. And Michael Porter made his reputation and his money by being the great theorist of zero-sum business strategy. If you win and they lose, that's a good thing. So suddenly, quite late in life, he's saying actually it's not really about taking value, it's about sharing value. So here's one quote from this article in the Harvard Business Review. "Companies remain trapped in an outdated approach to value creation that has emerged over the past few decades. They continue to view value creation narrowly, optimizing short-term financial performance in a bubble while missing the most important customer needs and ignoring the broader influences that determine their longer-term success." And at this point he gets really quite angry a bit later on. How else, he says, could companies overlook the well-being of their customers, the depletion of natural resources vital to their businesses, the viability of key suppliers, or the economic distress of the communities in which they produce and sell? How else could companies think that simply shifting activities to locations with ever lower wages was a sustainable solution to competitive challenges? And so, when you have one of the kind of great sort of strategic thinkers of our age sort of putting that challenge down to companies, you kind of know that something has changed. And one of the things we've been working on with a Finnish employers organization called the Association of Finnish Work is actually what's the problem with that problem of low wages? Because there's quite a lot of people out there, and I know this. We've heard a lot of this in Britain. I know you've heard a lot of it in Spain, is that all you actually need to do to be competitive is get wages down and make your labor force more flexible. Actually, it works for a while, but it doesn't work for a long time. And the reason it doesn't work is you start with low wages at the top, and what you get from low wages is low productivity. What you get from low productivity is low investment, and that means that actually the businesses can't actually invest in their societies or pay their social contribution. And you end up in the kind of going back around that cycle again. It's a sort of cycle of despair, really. But it's also, it's also a cycle where actually those businesses, and we'll come back to this later on, those businesses which are paying low wages effectively end up getting subsidized by the state to keep people in work. So actually you end up with this kind of miserable society where everything has been scraped away. And that makes it sound as if I'm making a political point. I'm not. I'm making an economic point here. So, to summarize the end of this section, the rules have changed. And if there's kind of one idea here from this section that you need to take away, people are connected now. They don't think of themselves just as consumers. They don't think of themselves just as people who go and buy something. They think of themselves as citizens with a kind of joined up view of what they're doing when they're spending their money and when they're not spending their money. So, second section is going to be around changing attitudes, and the data here is the Futures Company does an annual survey called Global Monitor as part of our research, and we survey 24 markets globally. And the data here of Spanish, it's all Spanish data, it's all 2014 from our survey earlier this year, and it comes from that survey. And so let's, but this is the kind of cheap and cheerful version of where those consumers and citizens are. This is a still or an image from the film Network in, I think in 1975, 1976, so kind of one of the other great recessions since the war. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. But here's the Spanish data. So just so you can understand the code, the green dots on there are Spain. The black dots are the average for all of the other countries. Actually, it's all of the other countries excluding China and Saudi Arabia, because if we ask those countries in Saudi Arabia and China, our researchers get locked up, so we don't do that. So, when you look at that top one, feel a lot of anger over there's one set of rules for the richest people and another set of rules for everybody else. In Spain, 71%, global average, 48%. A lot of anger over big business maximizes profit at the expense of community and consumers. Spain, 63%. The global monitor average, 44%. Have you taken actions over the past year out of anger, frustration with business and corporations, or thought less favorably of global brands? Spain, 40%. The rest of the average, 24%. So you can see here in Spain there's sort of some real kind of levels of anger. I don't need to tell you that. You can see it on the news. But it's always nice to have research which backs up what you see on the news. And up here, it's again another 50, but it's not just about being angry, it's actually about doing something. 55% agree we all have the right to challenge authority figures and hold them accountable against, and this is a Spanish data point over time. 64% in 2014 of our Spanish sample feel groups of individuals making small changes in their behavior can make a real difference in the world. And that's gone up from 53% in 2010. So you kind of have this sort of quite volatile mix of sort of angry but activist people out there who may or may not be interested in consumers, but whatever. And I think the other half of this is, that's all the kind of political stuff. But the other half of this is around the around attitudes to products and services. So this is just year-on-year data, and I have to say, I look at a lot of social research data. These are big jumps in a year, 3 to 4%, and you think, is that all right? Does that seem make sense? But actually, these are big jumps, year-on-year data. So, 71% buy products which will enhance their emotional well-being, as opposed to 57% last year. 67% contribute money or time to a charity or ethical cause you support. 59% buy products that keep you and your family safe from harm. And quite interestingly though, this is the kind of counter bit on here, 86% treat yourself to small indulgences, up from 79%. And one of the things that's interesting to us about looking at behavior of consumers in the wake of recession is that people sort of focused on the kind of the money they needed to spend, the money they must spend, but they also focused on the money they could spend to make them feel better. So, you know, if you couldn't afford to go to a restaurant, you might go to a cafe. You know, so you find a way of making sure that you could still have a good time, even if that good time was kind of less of a good time than it was before. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing there is that actually this is part of that kind of sort of mood around sort of part of well-being is actually a little bit of treating yourself. And quite a lot of businesses have done quite well about working out how to do that with consumers who've got less money to spend. This is from some research we did recently in Spain around cultural attitudes. So a kind of quote which sums up to this: there's a general disconnection in society, which is why we constantly feel the need to reconnect with the ones and the things that we love. And another one, there's definitely a really nice movement around let's create, let's help each other that's emerging. So you're kind of seeing this kind of swell, if you like, of sort of angry, possibly irritated, and kind of activist people who are trying to do something. And the last thing here is just about meaning, that actually when you look at meaning in buying things, Spain, you know, this is the Spanish data for personally consider owning luxury products to be a sign of success. 40% in Spain, 80% worldwide. You know, that's quite a big gap between the global average. Although I have to say that those global averages tend to be pushed up by the Asian data, which tends to be a little bit high. You know, it's less of a difference to Europe. And this is one of our cultural experts. It seems people are happy to spend a little more for what they love. It's less about showing off and more about what it means. They're aware of how much it takes to produce things. They really appreciate the quality attached to it. So just bringing this section to a close, this is from some work we did a couple of years ago on consumers, or people in the wake of the recession, and the way they understood value and understood the deal with businesses. And we kind of, after doing quite a lot of analysis, we came to the conclusion that they were looking for 4 things in different places, not always the same, but so in search of value, not just price, but value. Sometimes that was something that worked better, something that was better, sometimes it was something that's lasted for longer. In search of assurance, I talked about the horse meat scandal, the supply chain issues that sit behind the Rana Plaza director. They actually want to know that they're not personally going to get poisoned by something, but they also want to know that increasingly that what they're buying isn't going to harm somebody else. In search of mental space, I think this may not be an easy concept in Spanish, but I'm not sure. But what this is about is that people feel overloaded. Actually one of the consequences of living with less money is you have to be more careful, you have to make a lot more choices. So actually people are now sort of looking for solutions which actually remove unnecessary choices from their lives. And I'll talk about some examples before I move on. And the last one is quality, and obviously that's sort of traditionally around just quality of goods, something that lasts a lot longer, something that's better made, something that has some sort of emotional meaning in it. But it can also be about experiences, the quality of an experience, and we've seen a lot of that going on as well. So, if I look at, say, Danone in France, Danone has had a very expensive program which is about making it clear and visible to people who buy their milk where their milk comes from. They actually have a very big program about good quality milk from French farmers. They work with 35,000 farms. And they did some market research, and they discovered that actually most people thought the milk came from Poland and was being trucked for 2 weeks before it got to the 1 week before it got to the French market. So what they've done was they did a big sort of campaign which is about sort of assuring French consumers who care about where their milk comes from that it was coming from local farms and local places and local communities. But they're also at the same time sort of just giving a little bit of a quality message there. If you look at something like mental space, there's a kind of famous American example we use quite a lot, the $1 Shave Club. Some of you may know of it. So what the $1 Shave Club is based on the insight that most men don't really want to bother about shaving and buying razors. Razors is a very low interest category for men. What the $1 Shave Club does is send you some razors and sometimes a razor blade about once a month through the post and take some money out of your bank account. That's what it does. And the campaign, the advertising campaign which went viral, was very clever because it not only sort of communicated that this is a very simple thing and you won't have to worry about razor blades anymore, but it also communicated how much of the price of the big brand razor blades was going into paying for people like Roger Federer and all those sorts of sponsorship deals that they had to kind of keep their advertising budgets up. So it was kind of like saying, I can deal with your mental space problem, but you're also getting better value because Roger Federer is a great tennis player, but I don't necessarily feel that I need to pay him every time I buy a pack of razor blades. So let me move on. And what I'm going to do in this section is try and look at the ways in which some businesses have actually used some of that kind of insight I've just been talking about as a strategic tool. Because it's very easy to listen to all of this stuff and think, oh, well, corporate social relations can deal with that. And they're never on the board, are they, the corporate social relations people? They're always sort of out there somewhere. Actually, what we're seeing amongst businesses which are progressive and innovating is they're taking the kind of insights we've just been talking about and they're turning them into a business strategy which differentiates them in the marketplace. So these are the four ideas that I'm going to talk about here: service, distribution, reputation, and new business models. And just to say it again, what's the common thread in all of these things is they took a business problem, applied some new thinking about it around new ways in which consumers were thinking about their markets, and they turned it into a business proposition. So Mercadona, obviously there's one just down the road. They have managed to do a couple of things really. One is they've going back to the previous slide, they have a kind of very sort of tough mental space view of their thing. They reduce choice enough that you've got enough choice but not overwhelmed by it. But they do a couple of other things which are really important. They also pay their staff well, and they also train their staff quite heavily. And the reason they do that is they know that actually what they get is much, much better customer service. And in terms of a business problem, this was Mercadona's response to the entry of some very big, as you know, some very big supermarket chains into the Spanish market. Given Mercadona's size and profile, it wasn't going to be able to compete unless it did something different. And of course, people immediately say, well, supermarkets, that's a really low margin category. How can you afford to pay your staff well? Actually, the answer is that you actually get better returns when you pay your staff well. And in the States, we've seen an interesting experiment being going on, a live experiment this is. So the bottom line on this chain here is Walmart, and the top line is Costco. Not quite identical businesses, but similar enough. And obviously they start at the same point. That's a kind of same point of difference back in 2005. And what we see is over 10 years, Costco has way outperformed Walmart, which is kind of unusual. When I saw this data first, I'm so used to hearing that Walmart is a fantastically successful business, I was kind of a bit surprised. But the main difference between Costco and Walmart is that Walmart pays its staff $13 an hour on average, and Costco pays its staff $20 to $21 an hour. So actually the Costco staff want to help you. They're motivated. They don't want you to leave the store without having got what you want. The Walmart staff, it's kind of like they could care less, That's fine, you just carry on. I'll pick up my $13 and I'll go and collect my food stamps later on. So moving on to the next one, this is Coca-Cola, in fact. This is about distribution, and Coca-Cola has a really interesting program. It's the 5x20 program. And what they're trying to do in Africa and Asia, Coca-Cola, by the way, is much more optimistic about Africa than our speakers before the break. What they realized was that the program's designed to create 5 million women entrepreneurs in Africa and Asia between now and 2020. And what's interesting about this program is it has these sort of two things. The reason they wanted to do that was because they realized there were really big holes in their distribution system. So they were expanding into Africa and certain Asian markets, and they realized they just didn't have the distribution capacity to do it. They didn't have the retail capacity to hit their targets. So actually they're investing in women entrepreneurs to actually do that. And they're investing in women entrepreneurs because they've read the research. They know that actually if you invest in women entrepreneurs in those markets, you're actually much more likely to get stable, cohesive, growing communities than if you invest in male entrepreneurs. So that's the 5x20. And one of the things they've done at the same time is they've built this standalone unit for rural areas. And this, you can probably see it has a solar panel on the roof. It basically does two things. I mean, it sells quite a lot of Coca-Cola products, so I'm not going to be naive about this, but it also does a couple of other things. It also cleans water, so people can come here and get clean water from a tap, and it also allows people to recharge their phones or their devices. So effectively, they've invested in people, but they've also invested in a kind of a method for helping those people in rural areas become retailers in a way that benefits the business and benefits the communities. A classic example of the idea of shared value. The third example here is from Zappos, the online shoe retailer. And what they've done, they're based in Las Vegas, which may sound great if you're a European holiday maker, but actually it's a low-wage, declining tourist wage sort of town if you live there. And what they've done is they've moved to an area just outside of the center of Las Vegas, and they've turned it into a kind of business development park. And the reason they've done that is because actually it's actually not that easy to get staff to come and work in Las Vegas. But actually what they've discovered is that the people who come and work for them are really motivated by the idea of helping to regenerate part of Las Vegas by using the skills they've got with Zappos to actually sort of work in the business area around them. And the other example here was just a South African example about a food bank system where it's a SPAR Isonka program, where again they sort of embed themselves in the community, helping the community, making sure that food doesn't go to waste. The last example is a banking example. It's a British example. This is a bank that was spun out from one of the big British banks as a result of the financial crisis. And I'm sorry this is a lot of English on here, but one of the things they did when they launched was they effectively issued a challenge to their prospective customers. So these 5 questions: does your bank operate right across Britain but nowhere else? So, not internationally. Does your bank serve local people and local businesses and not big corporations? Does your bank refuse to gamble your money in overseas speculation? Does your bank say no to using its customers' money to fund investment banking? That's the kind of merchant banking arms. Does your bank use every penny its customers deposit to help other customers and nothing else? And it's striking when you read this what a deep challenge that is to the dominant banking models which we're told are essential to the smooth running of our financial system. And it's also striking that the bank, the Trustee Savings Bank, is the fastest growing bank in Britain, having launched a year ago. It's putting on customers faster than anybody else. So it's effectively turned all of the assumptions that conventional banking has about what you need to do to make money, and it's sort of resonating with its customers and potential customers. So in this final section, I'm just going to talk about this idea of the kinship economy. I'll make it clear what it is in a minute. And this is really about the kind of takeaways that maybe in terms of your businesses are kind of relevant, how you can sort of action some of that, even if you're maybe an SME rather than being Coca-Cola or Danone. So very simple. The idea of the kinship economy is that it's about relationships, and that the relationships that matter most are typically family or very local relationships, and they're about people and not brands. And if there's one way of sort of capturing this idea about the kinship economy, it's, would you do this to your mother? If you're a business, would you do this to your mother? And this placard is from a protest about a short-term finance company which was charging interest rates of 400%. But I've got it up there because this is the kind of third idea, really. Would you do this to your mother in terms of what do you do when you're doing business? And what it's not is picking up on the idea that well-being somehow is associated with happiness. And I've talked about both Zappos and Coke, and I've put these pictures up here to show that actually sometimes there's a bit of a gap between the marketing department and the rest of the business. Because actually what the kinship economy is not about is selling happiness, or putting it on a brand label. It's about something, or indeed delivering it. It's about something deeper than that. What it's about, and I'm sorry this slide's a bit sort of ugly, is about a transition from about the relationship between brands and consumers. So in the 20th century, all of that kind of marketing, all those marketing books we used to read in the 1980s and the 1970s, it was about brands going out there and engaging consumers and being really active. Actually, it's not anymore. It's about brands listening to people while they're having conversations and working out how they can help. That's the key insight. It's not about selling something. It's working out how you can help. And it's about, therefore, I'm not going to read all the detail on the slide, but it's about making the relationship and the conversation the core of that. And if you go back 15 years to the Clue Train Manifesto, which was one of the first books that addressed the way in which business might have to change as a result of the internet back in 1999, their kind of single idea was that markets are conversations. It was kind of going back to a very old idea of what a market was. And what we see in this is that actually by having conversations and by thinking about the shared good, that brands are broadening their horizons. And these are British brands, British shoe brands here. So originally the historical idea, 19th century, brands were a quality mark. This is Clark's of England, quite a famous brand if you're in England. Then around the 1980s, maybe the 1990s, they became something different. They became an expression of a desired identity. We had that whole wave of identity politics, and brands became part of that. And now they've become an expression of desired society. So this is Tom's shoes. If you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, they give a pair of shoes to somebody who needs one. And this idea is an idea that the Tom LaForge at Coca-Cola, who's been central to the development of the 5x20 program, has been talking about, that actually we're in a world where actually brands and businesses need to actually sort of be the change that they want to see in the world, and actually from doing that, they actually have opportunities to be much more profitable and to make much more money. And the final thing I'm just going to talk about, and this is kind of like sort of some, if you like, some guidelines, some principles, about the idea of well-being. A British, so back to well-being again, a British research institute, the New Economics Foundation, did a study recently where they looked at the factors that encouraged individual well-being. And when I looked at them, I realized they also encourage business well-being. And here they are, 5 ways to business well-being. The first one is to connect, and I think I've been talking about that all the way through. The second is to be active, to be engaged, to be out there, to be involved, in the same way that, say, Zappos is in Las Vegas. The third is to take notice. It's about watching. Pilar obviously talked about that a little bit at the beginning of her presentation. So actually you're noticing what the changes are, and that's by being involved in conversations. The fourth one is by learning, keeping on learning, so you're taking notice, but you're learning from that. And the last one is by giving. And I know that's not a word that traditionally businesses have been very big on, or it's been a matter of conscience, but actually it's only by giving, by putting things back, the businesses are actually going to be able to grow and innovate and invest in the future. Gracias.
¿Se oye? Me comentan que tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas. Yo tengo 2, o sea que si no hay ninguna las haré yo. ¿Alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Aquí hay 2.
one of your first slides was about three things: the economy, technology, and values. You said that managers and directors knew or discussed a lot about economy, knew and discussed a lot about technology, which I am not that sure, and the third one about the values. And at the very end of your presentation, you showed us how to take an individual stand towards how to get involved in values for the benefit of our businesses. But that can be a little bit biased. So can you tell us what is a more structured approach to know how values are changing in society, in the different territories, etc.? How a manager gets aware of the changes in values?
Well, I'm almost inclined to ask Pilar to answer that question for me, because there are lots of research methods which are about a mixture of ethnographic research and qualitative research and observation, which give a sense of what people are starting to value instead. I mean, let me give you, so sometimes it's just observation, sometimes it's supported by data. The early shifts in values tend to be more seen in observation rather than in data. But let me try and give you one example, which we've seen in Spain as well. In the UK and in Spain, one of the things that happened after the financial crisis is that people couldn't afford to go out so much, so they invited people back to their houses again, more than they used to. So what you're seeing, so it's a very small, simple thing, but it's about being a good host and being, an open host in a way that perhaps before the crisis, not so much. And a business like Sky, for example, then put a business idea on that in the UK, which was their Sky Sports program, like Canal Plus here, is very, very expensive. Not everybody can afford it. So they issued a day ticket for particular days. So if you wanted to invite your friends around and watch some sports event on your television, you could do that. So the trend, which was about sort of spending more time in home, you got to through basically qualitative research and ethnographic research, just talking to customers about the way their life had changed, and non-customers as well. And then obviously the business idea comes off the back of that.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Yo respecto a lo que tú preguntabas, que es un tema muy habitual con el que hablamos con muchos clientes, yo medio en broma, medio en serio, a veces les digo, coger más el metro, pararos en una parada de esta que no conozcáis, que os suene simplemente que la hayáis visto en un plano, y mirar qué hace la gente, cómo son, qué consumes. Yo creo que tenemos todos la enorme limitación de que nos movemos en entornos muy cerrados. Hablo del mundo empresarial. Hacemos estudios para presidentes de empresas multinacionales a nivel etnográfico para que se acerquen al consumidor. Y a veces nosotros en el despacho de broma decimos, es que si cogieran más el metro, si observaran más, a veces es un tema de actitud, no hay que hacer grandes investigaciones, es tener los ojos más abiertos, es cambiar nuestras rutas de ir al trabajo, movernos en barrios donde no hemos estado nunca, hablar con la gente joven que nos explicarán un montón de cosas. Entonces creo que a veces es un tema más de actitud que de a lo mejor hacer grandes inversiones. ¿Alguna preguntita más?
¿Es posible la compatibilidad entre la empresa tradicional y este nuevo mercado más selectivo? ¿Está la empresa tradicional destinada a desaparecer?
I don't quite know what you mean by the traditional company. I think I'd need to understand that a bit better.
Que si la empresa tradicional, familiar de toda la vida, es posible que sea compatible con este mercado, con unos consumidores más selectivos, si está destinada a desaparecer.
Oh, I understand now. Actually, I think small businesses can be really well placed in this market. You know, if you think about your experience of ringing up a business to try and get something changed, you know, typically when you ring up a big business, you go through a call center and, you know, they lose you and all the rest of it. When you ring up a small business because there's a problem, you typically speak to somebody who's involved in the business all the time. They actually pick up the phone and talk to you. So actually, you know, there's no reason why smaller family businesses shouldn't be able to do this. This is actually the sorts of things I've been talking about in my presentation aren't really about technology or scale. They're about sort of values and attitude. And there's a lot of small businesses, traditional businesses, in traditional sectors which can do the things I've been talking about very well.
Yo no me voy a resistir a hacerle una última pregunta, creo que no vamos a tener tiempo para mucho más. Me gustaría que, en base a todos los estudios de predicciones de futuro que vosotros hacéis, nos podáis decir, porque aquí seguramente hay personas de diferentes sectores, ¿qué sectores empresariales tienen en este momento más oportunidades y qué otros sectores lo van a tener más difícil para seguir creciendo?
I don't think that's necessarily a question about sector. I think that's maybe a question about business model. You know, I always like using the Mercadona example because it's always described as a sector which is under pressure and all the rest of it. In the UK, we've seen supermarkets, the smaller supermarkets, be able to use those sorts of approaches which Mercadona uses here and really transform themselves. I think the sectors that are running out of, or the business models that are running out of road, and we have a lot of these in the UK, are businesses which have used technology gains to squeeze money out of, improve their margins and so on. There's quite a lot in the utility sector, there are quite a lot in the financial sector. But actually, those are one-off gains, so now they have to just keep trying to find different ways of squeezing a little bit of extra money out. You know, any business that promises big growth to its shareholders, but doesn't have a business model that actually allows for big growth is going to be a problem. Because actually, one of the other things I think is true here is that we have to be realistic. There are opportunities for growth out there, but you know, they're sort of steady growth, the kind of sort of growth we used to see in the 50s and the 60s, maybe, you know, 2, 3, 4%. They're not 7 or 8%. Any business that has 7 or 8% has either been lucky or is lying, you know.
Muchísimas gracias por tu ponencia. Yo creo que ha sido súper interesante. Muchísimas gracias a todos vosotros.